So Keith, thank you very much for making time to share your insights into the future of leadership. But before we go into the future, can you tell us a little bit about your own background? Where did you grow up?
Fantastic. Well, thank you very, very much for the opportunity to have this conversation. I'm extremely humbled that you see me worthy enough to be interviewed as a future leader. And then just answering your question directly, I grew up in Durban on the east coast of South Africa. And I've now just spent just a little more than half my life in Johannesburg. So it's just 25 years that has passed since I've been in Johannesburg.
Right. And what was your dream career as you grew up?
Strangely enough, I'm a musician at heart.
Oh, really?
And I have a passion for music.
Right.
I really wanted to become a singer, musician.
Right.
That was my dream career. And that changed as time went by because growing up in the environment you did in the 70s, 80s and 90s, it never paid the bills. So I was forced to choose an alternate career in business, and I adapted my dream and always then dreamt of really becoming a business person.
And your singing career, did you perform?
I did. I did one concert with the Natal Performing Arts Council many years ago as a teenager. I sang extensively because of my background in church. I sang in concerts all around KwaZulu-Natal. I was very much involved in church in South Africa, Johannesburg,
right.
and sang extensively. I've since, I think the last time I sang was at my wedding.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So you're not practicing anymore. So, Keith, as you grew up, who inspired you in those early days?
I think one of the greatest inspirations was my mother. My mother grew out of humble beginnings, just like my dad.
Right.
Both of them were educators. They saw the value of having a solid education, and they made investments to support and sacrifices to support my growth as a young man. I think education is not just an education that's formal but informal, and it begins in home. And I think that's where my interest in learning and growing and knowing really began, with the influence of my mum and my dad. But I think my granddad, my late granddad, who was a lay minister, a preacher,
right,
was also a great source of inspiration. He had a tremendous passion for what he did, to the extent that he would cycle all the way down to Port Shepstone from Durban or all the way up the north coast to Stanger just to preach. These were significant inspirations in my life to spur me on to achieve and to be passionate about what I want to do in this life.
Right, so you went to school in Durban,
Correct.
I assume, and then where did you study?
I studied at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, then the University of Natal. I did an undergraduate degree in commerce with a specialization in information systems, business administration and marketing. Coming from the background I did, I was then put to work and tried to get as work experience as quickly as I could, and I studied an honors degree part-time through UNISA. That continued, and I've completed those studies up in Johannesburg when I moved in 1995 to Johannesburg. And studying never stopped, so I studied for 12 years after finishing school, non-stop, all part-time, and I managed to implement all of those learnings that I had in school in my work life.
So Keith, where did you start your career?
My career really began at Edgar's in the fashion industry, strangely enough. I had a very colourful background, moving from the fashion into the transport industry with Transnet and their Spoornet division.
Right.
Then I moved over into the South African Revenue Services, which is tax and customs.
Right.
I then had a 12-year stint running companies of my own in the technology and telecommunications space, and then joined VCX, a large systems integration organization, and then decided I needed to become part of an OEM, a big global organization, and that's when I joined Hitachi Vantara. It's been phenomenal. As you can see, my background is very colorful. I've had diverse experience and diverse exposure to various leaders in various industries.
So looking back over your career, Keith, would you say there was a major turning point, or maybe a number of turning points where your career could have gone different, but you decided to take it this way?
I think the most significant turning point for me was at the South African Revenue Service, where I rediscovered a sense of purpose that was aligned to nation building. Had one of the most inspirational leaders in Praveen Gordhan. I joined as the head of international relations then, and went around the world raising a lot of international money to pay for the modernization and transformation of SARS under the leadership of Praveen Gordhan.
Right.
It just realigned me to a noble purpose that was beyond my own. How do we actually get South Africa out of the doldrums of apartheid and modernize it and make it a world-class country of significance?
So that was in the 90s, I assume.
So I joined SARS in 1999,
Right.
and that was a year just after Praveen Gordhan was appointed Deputy Commissioner at the South African Revenue Service, and then he became appointed Commissioner shortly afterwards.
Right. And Keith, what is driving you today?
Pretty much the same thing, making a significant difference in transforming society, the way society thinks. I think a lot has to do with culture, and culture is the way things are done, a system of habits. And like to look at how we transform South Africa and get back to that world-class status it once enjoyed just post-democracy.
Right.
I think we have a role to play in developing and changing the face of leadership in this country that will have a significant long-term impact. I believe that leadership is transgenerational, so it should have a transgenerational impact. And it's not about me and it's not about you. It's about the leaders that will come after us, that will augment and build on what we've left behind.
So Keith, let's go back to your time at SARS. At the time, SARS was the envy of the world, right? It was
Correct.
a world-class organization, and you did world-class leadership work. Can you tell us a little bit about what exactly you did at SARS in terms of leadership?
Sure. So I think all kudos to the then Commissioner Praveen Gordhan, who obviously went on to be Minister of Finance and is now Minister of Public Service and Enterprise. He appointed me as Chair of the Technology Governance Committee, and I managed to give oversight to how technology investments were being made so that they weren't just great toys for tech people to play with, but they had proper business outcomes and business benefits that would translate into how the organization would be modernized and how it would function.
Right.
I think the second most significant project that I got involved in at his request was to run the Strategic Revenue Analysis Project. It broke down into 3 work streams, the first of which was to come up with a scientific means of quantifying the size of the tax gap in South Africa. And lots of experts, tax experts in South Africa, had anecdotal amounts in their head, but there was no data-driven approach to saying this is the size of the tax gap due to tax evasion or crime in the informal economy, for instance. The second work stream involved doing a sectoral analysis of which were the biggest contributors to tax evasion on a sector-by-sector basis, and there were some culprits which I won't divulge.
Right.
And the third work stream was building a predictive model for what future revenue collections could be based on different variables such as the proliferation of HIV/AIDS and the erosion of the tax base. The second, exchange rate movements. The third, interest rate movements, and so on.
Right.
And I think it armed the Commissioner and the Minister of Finance at that point with more credible information in terms of what revenue collections could be going forward. It was really important to assemble a team of competent people, so I brought in people from all over the world that were really world-class and were able to actually bring their collective intelligence to make sure we had a data-driven approach to firstly quantifying the gap and secondly predicting what revenue collections could be.
And I believe, Keith, this model was so successful that you then leveraged your insights and applied them in the Western Cape for human settlement.
Yes, I think based on my involvement in some of the business strategy of SARS and the formulation of that strategy, I was then on loan to Minister Sisulu,
Right.
who was then Minister of Human Settlements. And they had a flagship project which they were trying to kick off the ground, which was the Enter Gateway project. And I actually facilitated and wrote the business plan for the upgrading of all the informal settlements in the Western Cape. That was a 2 billion rand project. It was absolutely remarkable to work across the 3 spheres of government, national, provincial and local,
Right.
and to make sure that we pulled all of those 3 spheres together, because they typically don't always talk to each other in very nice ways, to make sure that the project was a success. It took a little while to get off the ground, but eventually resulted in tremendous success. It was the ministry's flagship housing project in South Africa.
Right. So Keith, let's talk about leadership. And I know it's a big question, but what does the future of leadership mean to you?
So the future of leadership has everything to do with how we groom leaders to succeed us. I believe that it would be remiss of us if we have a myopic focus just on ourselves and what we're doing in the now. I believe that some of our previous masters within the apartheid regime had foresight, and they built for a 50 and 100-year time frame in terms of how they would put essential building blocks in place that would create a burgeoning economy. And some of those building blocks were cheap electricity, cheap steel, cheap telecommunications, cheap transport, and cheap agrochemicals. And you had the birth of the Escoms, the Telcoms, the Foscors, the ISCORs of the world. And I'd like to look at how we have a vision that's beyond our lifetime, something that can be achieved and something that somebody can pass the baton on to a new generation of leaders that will achieve this eventual post-50, 100-year type of vision.
Right. Now, Keith, what have you learned from your own leadership journey that you consider most important for building future leaders, if there's one quality or maybe two?
So firstly, let me start by saying that leadership is a privilege. It's not a right. It has to be earned. And I think that's very significant because it allows you to adopt a different approach to leadership, which is pretty much predicated on servanthood and the ability to serve others. It's not about amassing great wealth. I believe that wealth is a consequence, not a quest. And it's important enough to understand that if you don't have an impact beyond yourself and beyond your immediate sphere of influence, then you've actually missed the mark from a leadership perspective. So servanthood is definitely one of the qualities I'd like to see. The kind of people that I work with, I like to also understand how we surround ourselves with people that are better than ourselves. So learning is a fundamental pillar of leadership. The ability to stay humble and learn is critical to how we actually navigate the future.
And Keith, when you speak to aspiring leaders and maybe even your own children, what is it you tell them about social media? How should they navigate social media to build their own leadership brand?
So social media can either work for you or against you, and you've got to use it in the most appropriate means possible to build your own brand, like you mentioned. I think being positive, ensuring that you are always encouraging, you're always imparting something using social media. It has a very broad reach, not just locally, but globally. And it has the potential to influence people beyond your immediate reach, like I said. I think social media should revolve around imparting some of the lessons learned in in the journey of leadership. Also warn people about the pitfalls of leadership, the pitfalls in our society. And I believe that we should always use positive messaging to get ourselves noticed, but not just noticed, so that we can actually influence people for good. So the whole concept of social innovation, empowering good, is important to actually use as a branding mechanism in terms of how you want to get yourself out into the marketplace on social media.
Right. Now, Keith, if you were to design a curriculum for future leaders, what are the new skills you would want to factor in?
So first and foremost, I think premised on the crisis of leadership we currently experience in our country now, one of the fundamental tenets of leadership, which is a focus on ethics, moral leadership, and an ethical lifestyle, should be one of the first and foremost parts of a curriculum. I think it's a gaping hole in how we are training and developing young leaders for tomorrow. We have an immediacy, an urgency around the now. So I like to look at how we train leaders to be future casters. How do I predict what's going to happen based on my analysis of my environment? I think the thing that's missing to a great extent is intuition, leadership intuition. We've also become so reliant on data that we fail to use leadership intuition, gut feel, leadership by gut feel. And I think that we can start teaching people how to become more intuitive, how to become more self-aware. And I think that's an important part of building into a curriculum. It's a very soft part of leadership that's almost never touched or covered in a business school. You always have set modules that teach you the administrative part of leadership, or the financial part of leadership, or the governance part of leadership, but we never get into teaching people how to use their own intuition and gut feel adequately enough.
Right. And Keith, what is your advice for future leaders? And maybe again, looking back at your own leadership journey, since there's really no shortcut to leadership, what are the challenges they should expect? What are maybe the pitfalls they should be aware of and anticipate in their journey?
So I think everybody wants to get their name in lights. They want to become famous. They want to hobnob with the rich and famous. It's very appealing to associate yourself with important people that are well known in society. But I think there are many leaders that are not famed, yet have a significant impact on society and on community life. I think we need to be realistic in terms of the leaders that we want to pattern ourselves or model ourselves against. I'd like to think that I'm a success in my private life and then a success in my public life. And I believe that needs to be a congruency between both spheres of a leader's life. You have people that are amazing leaders in the marketplace, but they're failures at home. And I believe that the kind of model role model leaders we should aspire to be are people that marry the ethical, moral fabric of what their lives is all about with what you see in the workplace.
Right. And Keith, as a mentor to future leaders, can you maybe share a success story or two where you mentored an upcoming leader and that person took your advice to heart?
One of them springs to mind is a young lady that came to me with an idea at the time. She was a victim of abuse, and she wanted to look at how we could leverage celebrities because of their fame and use them in a way that will raise funding to combat abuse and help victims of both child and women abuse. With just an idea, we started an NGO called Celebrities for Humanity without any money. We ran an art competition. National Geographic sponsored part of that with the National Geographic Schools magazine, advertised the art competition. The South African Broadcasting Corporation also gave us free advertising to the amount of about 400,000 Rand.
Right.
And we managed to publicize this competition. It ran locally in South Africa. Lots of companies to sponsor prizes, and lots of young people started painting, illustrating against abuse and victims of abuse. We then entered that into an international competition, art competition, with I think it was called, can't remember the name offhand.
Right.
But it was run in Belgium, Indonesia, France, Canada, the US, and it had many streams to it. Basically, we managed to submit the South African winner into the overall international competition, and he had actually won the international contest. And the winning art was flown into outer space on NASA Mission 122 with Captain John McBride.
Really?
With zero money and just with people with an idea and a will to do it. We had I must say, the goodwill. We enjoyed the goodwill of one of the big law firms in South Africa. They did the registration of this NGO pro bono. They didn't charge us a cent. We leveraged the goodwill of the South African Broadcasting Corporation, who sent journalists to Belgium to actually cover this in the news. It was absolutely remarkable, and to see something just birthed out of an idea get wings and run internationally was absolutely remarkably mind-blowing.
And tell us, Keith, are there any role models of leadership that you encountered in your career, maybe in your environment, in your community, that you believe future leaders should learn from?
Absolutely. Having a very strong grounding in church, I've had a tremendous influence of spiritual leaders. I believe in the three wise men. Every leader should have the three wise men in their lives, just like Jesus did. One is somebody that will be able to give you spiritual guidance. The second, somebody that will help you navigate the murky waters of ethics, because there's always grey issues. There's not everything's black and white. And the last mentor should be somebody who is a business person that can guide you through some of the business decisions that you face on a day-to-day basis in running big corporations. So I've had all three on a continued basis, and they have changed from time to time. I believe that mentors should be mentors that mentor you to their strengths. And I think the people that I look up to tremendously, like I said earlier on, they have a significant congruency between their private and their public life. People that spring to mind, Thuli Madonsela, who is an upstanding, upright citizen of this country that has a no-nonsense attitude, that dispenses justice, is fair and equitable, and it has a noble interest in seeing our country rebuild itself and take center stage in the international arena once again. The other is Mogoeng, the Chief Justice. I think he's a remarkable leader. And here you see the congruency between private and public life all come together. So those are the two that stand out. And then I've had a number of different role model leaders from a business perspective, Praveen Gordon being one of them, perhaps the most significant in my career to date.
Right. Now, Keith, how can our listeners get hold of you, and where should they follow you?
So I'm actively involved on LinkedIn. I think it's Kenneth _Kenneth. I publish extensively on almost a daily basis on LinkedIn, so I'm most active on there. But I'm available on Facebook, Keith Kenneth once again. Very simple to remember. I very rarely get involved on Twitter, but I am involved on Twitter and Instagram. So it's very easy to pick up Keith Kenneth as a handle on all of those mediums.
And last but not least, Keith, is there one piece of advice that you would like to convey to future leaders that they should implement in their own lives?
Yes, I think I can't help but reiterate what I said earlier about leadership being a privilege, not a right. I think the whole thing about being humble, the whole thing about being open-minded, having an appetite to learn, about understanding the impact that culture has on shaping and changing society. And I think it's part of the very fabric of a society, the culture that we actually promote. One of the most important things is that you said earlier on, there are no shortcuts. So how do you actually follow the steps? I think failure is also a critical part of leadership. And it's not a crime to fail. As a matter of fact, I think that if you failed, you're a better leader than you were before. So I think we should be open enough to failure and not become so self-critical. Those are some of the basic things I'd like to leave behind with my listeners.
Well, Keith, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your wisdom and your leadership journey, and reminding us that we should all have the 3 wise mentors in our lives.
Fantastic. You're welcome. Thank you.